of serving on faculty over the last 17 plus years. So it's great to be here. It's great to see some current students, some former students from up the road at Ambrose. Keitha invited me this morning to come alongside you here at West Springs to consider kind of a larger topic and conversation in this season of ministry here related to outreach and evangelism while considering our cultural context. And so I want to do three things with us this morning. And then I want to open it up for a little bit of conversation and Q&A afterwards. The first thing I want to do is lay the tracks in Scripture and Solomon's desire for a God-listening heart, asking what it might mean for us in the context of today's topic. Second, I want to draw on some of my own sociological research with those who say they have no religion, one of the fastest growing, quote-unquote, religious groups in Canada and the Western world, to understand who are they, what can we learn, and how do we explain sort of the cultural environment around this group within Canadian society. And then third and finally, I'm going to turn our attention to the topic of evangelism, drawing on some of our research at the Flourishing Congregations Institute, and try to bring this conversation together with that we learn about those who say they have no religion. So, as a primer, make sure this works, but it is not at the moment, so I may have you just push the slide. Oh, we're good? There we go, perfect. We're going to create a bit of space afterwards for questions and comments, and so I just want to prime the pump that as you hear some of the things this morning to be thinking toward these ends. What are you hearing? What ideas are bubbling up, and what questions arise? And then we'll have a microphone afterwards and roam around for some thoughts that you have in light of these things. All right. 1 Kings 3:3-14, we just heard Solomon has just become king following David, and he has a dream where he makes a request of God. And in verse 9, and some translations show that Solomon asks God for a God-listening heart. I was inspired to build on this text from a lecture given at the Diocese of Würzburg, just southeast of Frankfurt in Germany in 2022 by German sociologist Hartmut Rosa. A lecture that he later turned into his 2024 book, Democracy Needs Religion. Rosa, who is not a Christian insofar as I understand, argues that, quote, a listening, receptive, and responsive heart is precisely what we need as a society and as individuals to lead successful lives and to enjoy a successful coexistence, end quote. He carries on describing how society is plagued by the inability to listen well to one another, when we immerse ourselves in polarized camps to the exclusion of others. And I would add from a wealth of other sociological and psychological data that in simpler ways, we've cluttered our lives to the point that we're losing our ability to be present to and with one another, often interrupting and talking over others, finishing other people's sentences, turning the conversation about ourselves, and failing to truly be present and to listen to one another. And this happens in all social aspects of our lives, with our children, with our parents, with our siblings and co-workers and neighbors and fellow congregants. Rosa goes on to suggest that religious groups are uniquely positioned via its liturgies and practices, beliefs, and ways of being to help nurture a listening heart. This is what we're doing this morning. The liturgy, the ritual that we go through before communion, is a way of orienting our ability to give us a God-listening heart. As we sing songs, as we lift our prayers, this is exactly what we are doing on a weekly basis. A listening heart is a fitting frame during this season of Epiphany. Without a listening heart, it's difficult to be attentive to Christ's manifestation and revelation during this season in the Christian calendar, with significant implications for how we live and interact with others. And thus my invitation is first and foremost for us to have a listening heart to God, to consider the habits and practices that we could or do foster that would strengthen a listening heart to God. And second, growing out of a listening heart to God, in what ways is God stirring us to have a listening heart to others and to the times around us? In what ways might we have a listening heart to the data that I'm about to reveal, some of the analysis that is just one way that we can have a listening heart to the world around us, to our neighbors, our coworkers, our family, and so forth. And so I invite you to consider this conversation of outreach and evangelism and the cultural context around us from this listening heart posture. God, please give us a listening heart. So, to speak of outreach and to speak of, let me try this. Still no. Oh, there we go. To speak of outreach and evangelism, it is important to understand this fastest growing group in Canada and the modern Western world, those who say they have no religion. I'm going to share a little bit of research from a couple of books that I've authored or co-authored over recent years related to this group, and we'll share some data and interpretation about this group. So, I'm sure you all know these things. Every 10 years, Statistics Canada sends you a survey. It's called the Canadian Census. And on that census, it asks the question, among others, what religion, if any, do you identify with? Okay? The data we're looking at here captures those Canadians who select no religion when asked this question. It's increased from around 10% in the early 1980s to about one-third of the Canadian population, and you see this in the top right-hand side of the screen. Here you see a comparison between Canada and the United States, which we talk about in one of our books. I'm not going to go through those particulars here, but the growth of those who say they have no religion grew earlier and faster in Canada than the United States, though if we extend this trend line through to 2026, we would find that these lines are very, very close together between our two countries. Now, another thing that we know about this group is that younger generations are more likely to say that they have no religion. And so starting at the top of this slide, you will find that younger generations are the most likely to say they have no religion. And then as you work your way down the image here, you'll find that older generations are the least likely to say that they have no religion. There are lots of other demographics we know. If we were to kind of put up the stereotypical person who says they have no religion in Canada or the United States or much of the modern Western world, we would know that they are young, they are male, they are single, they have no children, and they are born in Canada. Now, this does not mean, to be clear, that if you are young or male or single or have no children or born in Canada, that you therefore have no religion. Okay? It just means that those who say they have no religion are more likely to have one or more of these demographic traits within society. Now, one of the things that we do as sociologists is we compare different regions. We know that our social environment matters for how we think about the world. And so as you go across Canada, you will find different rates of those who say they have no religion. You can't necessarily see all these particulars. I'll just highlight a couple things. At the top of this map here captures Canada as a whole. 53% of Canadians, as of 2021 census, say that they identify as Christian. This doesn't mean that they embrace the beliefs or practices of Christianity. It simply means that when asked, what religion, if any, do you identify with? They say Christian. Okay? 53%. This was 76% 20 years ago. This is one of the most significant social changes and shifts in Canadian history in terms of identification. Conversely, we find that just over 35% of Canadian adults say that they have no religion. I captured this a couple slides ago. Now, in Alberta, the common framework we have in Alberta is that this is the Bible Belt of Canada. This is a myth, and it has always been a myth, okay? And here's some data just to sort of poke at some of the myths and understandings we think we have about society. So, those who identify as Christian, 48%. Fewer than half of Albertans identify as Christian. Okay? Over 40% say they identify as having no religion. And maybe in the Q&A we can go into some of the reasons for why that is. But simply to say that Alberta is not the Bible Belt that perhaps many have suggested we are. The other thing I'll say from the provincial data here, and I don't have time to go through all the different regions here, but the regions where you find the highest rates of those who say they have no religion, which is on the West Coast, and those who have the lowest rates of no religion on the East Coast, that this pattern has always been the case in Canadian history. And there's lots of social and historical reasons for why that is that I won't go into today. But what you see here is a shared pattern across the country, but across the country, the growth of those who say they have no religion is occurring, from the East Coast to the West to the North. Now, one of the most interesting things to try to capture what exactly is going on here is to explain why people say they have no religion and what partially contributes to the growth of this particular group. And here I draw on some of my earlier work, a couple of chapters in my book, The Meaning of Sunday, that talks about some of these things, and there's several other books over the last decade that unpack some of these things. And so very briefly, 6 kind of drivers, if you will, that have contributed to those who say they identify as having no religion. And this is predominantly among those who were raised in religious households, who for one reason or another decided to step outside of that religious upbringing to now say that they have no religion. This has been the central driver historically in Canadian society. Number 1, it has become increasingly socially acceptable to say that you have no religion. This was not the case 30, 40, 50 years ago. To say that you had no religion came with great social cost, potentially with your family, with your neighbors, with your coworkers, and so forth. That has shifted, that has changed. In fact, there's a lot of research that would suggest in Canada especially that the stigma remains for those who say they are devout and religious on many different religious traditions, okay? So the social environment matters for people willing to be kind of a card-carrying, I have no religion. Number 2, a reaction to the Christian right. Our geographic proximity to the United States and the strong fusion between the Christian right and politics and evangelicalism has served as a main driver for many out of Christianity in particular. Okay? Regardless of what you think theologically and politically, and I'm not making a statement on either case here, just descriptively, sociologically, we know we have reams of evidence to suggest that these two things hang together. And that bleeds over into Canada, right? We consume American media, and this shapes people's perceptions of religion in society. Number 3, parents giving children the choice. Now, this is a contentious issue. Many of you who are parents know that this is a contentious thing on many fronts. And the data is clear that the family is the single greatest influencer over a child's faith development into their young adult years, into their adult years, and so forth. And the ways in which parents approach choice with children, we see over the course of time, has had over the long term a corrosive effect over the development of religious beliefs and practices among children. And that could be a whole talk in and of itself, and maybe in the Q&A we'll pick up on some of those things, but data is clear on this. Number 4, intellectual disagreements. Right? People just disagree with the theological beliefs of religious communities related to the afterlife, miracles, the idea that God loves people, and yet they look at their own existence around them, views on gender and sexuality, science, and so forth. There's this sense that I just can't get there and agree with the religious group on these particular ideas. 5th, social influences. Social influences are one of the most significant impacts on people being part of a religious community or not being part of a religious community. And the ways in which this has contributed to the growth of those who say they have no religion is twofold. Number 1, they have stronger ties outside of their religious community, and that influence of those ties outside of their religious community has contributed to sort of pulling them outside of that religious community. And second, and related to this, the ties that they have within a religious community are relatively weak. That is, there's not enough to keep them part of this group as they're being pulled in this other direction. This is why social ties within congregations matters greatly for all kinds of things, including those who say that they have no religion. And then finally, life transition. You move away for university, you have a death in the family, and so forth. Life transitions disrupt the social communities that we have. And when you move from one location to the next, having to reestablish, find a new community, and so forth. So, there's lots of intricacies here, but it gives us just kind of a broad picture of some common themes of contributing factors to those who say they have no religion, predominantly among those who were raised within a religious context. Now, we know, sociologically, that most people who say they have no religion have grown up within religious traditions, and some of these factors contribute to them taking a step outside of that. What we are seeing more recently, however, is a shift towards what sociologists call cradle nuns or irreligious socialization. That is, religious nuns, those who say they have no religion, who are raised by religious nuns. They're not raised in any kind of religious context per se. And this is a shift that we're seeing in society. So you can imagine, if you kind of think about raised in a religious tradition, I leave that religious tradition, one day potentially I get married and or have my children. How am I going to raise my children? I'm going to raise them without religion. Okay? And you follow that across successive generations. And so we see this becoming a more prominent pathway or descriptor for those who say they have no religion. On the right-hand side, you'll see data on Canada in particular, and you'll find that those who say they have no religion are more likely to come from contexts where one parent had no religion, okay, what sociologists call mixed religion parenting contexts. Okay? As soon as you split the house, you've already weakened the likelihood of religious transmission. Okay? And we also find that those who say they have no religion are more likely to do so when at least one parent never attended religious services. There is something fundamentally important about this communal gathering, doing so on a weekly basis in a committed way with our children, that is absolutely critical to contribute to maintaining ongoing faith practice into our adult lives. This does not mean, to be clear, that this is a guarantee. We all know that there are no guarantees, and we perhaps know this in our own experiences. But this gives the best possible chance for that to occur into one's adult life. All right, so this is a little bit on those who say they have no religion. I want to turn now to the topic of evangelism. And one question that many church leaders are exploring these days is how might we think about evangelism in the context of those who say they have no religion? Right? The implicit assumption is if we have this growth of those who say they have no religion, then this is the group that we ought to, quote unquote, evangelize. What does that actually mean? How might we think about these things? As a reminder, again, here across Canada, 53% of Canadians identify as Christian, over 35% say that they have no religion. What is not shown in this data, and what there's a growing amount of studies that actually show this, is that there's two groups in society who have a particularly negative view toward one another in Canadian society when it comes to this topic of religion and non-religion. On one end, you have, broadly speaking, evangelicals, and on the other side, you have atheists. Data after data after data show that atheists do not like evangelicals and evangelicals do not like atheists. And it's present in all kinds of ways. Okay? Now, let's just think about this for a moment. However you're approaching this conversation, whatever's going on in your mind right now as we think about those who say they have no religion and evangelism, this is a problematic starting point. If you are trying to think theologically and practically, and I would argue sociologically, about this conversation. If you start with a negative perception or view of the other, however defined, and atheists are just a subgroup of those who say they have no religion, right? It's a very diverse group, but this is a troubling starting point for thinking about this conversation. I want to draw on a number of studies that we've been part of and I've been involved with leading at the Flourishing Congregations Institute related to evangelism. Some of the things that we know about evangelism is that people are more likely to evangelize if A, they believe that evangelism is important. And you can kind of do this, will be an informal, don't answer out loud, just in your head. This will be like an informal thing. Like, do you believe that evangelism is important or not? Okay? And again, I'm just thinking sociologically. At the level of belief this matters. You can sort of iron out what that means theologically and how you navigate that in this conversation. But belief is really important. Second, they have a perceived responsibility to evangelize. So you might believe that evangelism is important, but you might believe that that's someone else's job and not mine. That weakens the likelihood of one actually evangelizing. Belief matters in this regard. And then third, actually attending church regularly. These three things hang together. Why? Because the community matters. It reinforces the beliefs and attitudes and practices that we hold to be true within our religious community. And we are taught and reminded every week of those things, such that we perhaps believe that evangelism is important and or that we believe that we ought to actively participate in that. A second thing that stands out in a number of our studies is that social ties and personal invitation are the primary link for those who join a religious group. I teach on a lot of super interesting things, but one of the super interesting things is on cults and new religious movements, okay? 1970s, there's a lot of attention to these cults and new religious movements that are growing around society. And a lot of people in society are a little concerned about this, and they're trying to figure out why on earth are people joining these cults and new religious movements, Okay? And one of the lead explanations is that they had friends inside the groups who invited them into those groups. In fact, if you look outside of cults and new religious movements, and you look at religious groups worldwide, that the main pathway for conversion, or evangelism, to use sort of a theologically specific term here, the main pathway is someone inside that group invited them into that group. Okay? It's not the only pathway, and I'm sure we could all think of different stories where that hasn't been the case, but personal invitation is the number one contributing factor to those who join a religious group. Now, final thing I'll say here. Different studies, including some of our own more recently, have tried to capture in the pews, different churches, different traditions across the country, different national contexts, etc., have tried to identify how many in the pews are actually converts. And how do we measure converts? What counts and what doesn't count, etc. Okay? I'm going to use the strictest definition or measure here. That is, those who have not been raised within that particular religious tradition, who now find themselves within that particular religious tradition. And we find that about 10 to 15% of those in any congregation on any given week would be converts by this definition. In fact, what we know about church growth is that most churches that are growing are not growing primarily due to conversion or evangelism, despite what many churches will tell themselves and like to think about themselves. There are exceptions to this, okay? But by and large, most church growth comes about from transfer growth. You leave this church and you go to this church. The concept in sociology is called circulation of the saints, right? You're circulating from one congregation to the other. This is the primary pathway, or you have a lot of children and you retain those children. Contribute, right? It's a great church growth strategy. Just have a lot of children and retain them. Or, as we experience here in Canada, with increasing immigration and from the global south and east, which is also the center of Christianity worldwide today. All these are good things, and they all contribute to church growth, but those are different than evangelism. And so I think this is where sociological data can be helpful to be honest with ourselves, to understand some of those dynamics and realities, and then to proceed out of those understandings moving forward. Here's some things that we've learned in these recent studies about how Canadians approach or think about evangelism. We know that Canadians are more likely to show their faith as a mode or means of evangelism versus telling others about their faith or actually inviting others to attend their church or congregation. And there are lots of reasons for why that is. And the number one reason is that we have this sort of Canadian narrative that says, I don't want to be too exclusive, I don't want to come across as offensive, etc., that we're very tame and timid in this regard. And so here's kind of the classic Canadian approach to evangelism. I'm going to be a good, kind, pleasant person to you, my neighbor, my coworker, my family member, and I hope that one day you ask me why I'm kind and pleasant, right? And then I'm going to tell you it's because I have Jesus in my heart, and then we're going to evangelize, right? When's the last time someone asked you why you're a kind, pleasant person? Which either means you're not kind or pleasant, but we'll bracket that explanation for a moment. But more accurately, I think this is just part of just being a good Canadian, generally speaking, right? So this is not a helpful strategy for evangelism, but this is how most people think about this. I'm just going to be kind and pleasant, hope you ask me, etc. I'm suggesting here, through sociological data, that it needs to be something more than that. But it has to grow out of personal relationship. Personal relationship is key. Okay? Random conversations with random strangers in a Canadian context in 2026, it might pay dividends and you might yield some fruit in this regard, but all of the sociological data that we have suggests that this is not the main way by which people actually come to faith in any kind of religious tradition. We asked, this comes from, I should note here, this comes from survey data with over 9,000 Canadians across 250 churches in the country, across theological traditions, etc. And when we asked Canadians in the pews about the reasons why they either don't evangelize or sort of the fears that they hold, here are the 5 things that rise to the surface. Number 1, a lack of confidence. Number 2, the perception of increased antagonism or resistance to Christian values and the Christian church. Whether or not that's true This is people's perception, and we know that people's perceptions shape their reality. Third, fear of rejection. Fourth, few non-believers as friends, which I'll just say as a side point. It is difficult to identify as an evangelical, to go therefore and share the good news, and not have friends who don't identify as Christian. This is a problematic incongruency between what we say we believe and how we actually behave and act in our lives. And then finally, a lack of training. This really is an opportunity for congregations to help, right? And this is where I pass the baton to Keitha later on and say, I've done my job, I've sort of outlined the problem, now I say, okay, now you guys figure it out on the ground, right? How do you train and equip within a local church context to process some of these kinds of things? And in what ways are these present or not within our congregation here? All right, final data point, and then we'll open it up for discussion in a moment. In our most recent survey in partnership with Alpha Canada, surveyed almost 1,000 church leaders in 2024. And we asked a couple questions to congregations about whether they track and mark conversions. It's important that we pay attention to the things that we believe are most important, whether it's our personal life and our congregational or organization's life and so forth. And so we ask congregations, to what extent are you tracking those who have come to Christian faith in and through their congregation? And you find here on the left-hand side that 52% of congregations say yes and 48% say no. The inference here is that if we aren't tracking this, is this actually an important marker for us? And how do we track this? And why do we track it? And to what ends do we track it? As important is the ways in which we mark conversions. And this is the data that you see in the middle. I want to just start at the bottom there, where you see that 39% say that they don't celebrate or acknowledge conversions in any way, shape, or form. I think this is a red flag, if you will, because the ways in which we publicly mark someone coming to faith actually fulfills a number of different functions within a congregation's life, whether this through a baptism, through sharing a testimony, and so forth, and you see some of the data there. I want to conclude with two stories, probably the two most memorable baptisms in my own congregation in recent memory, whereby heard from a young single mother sharing her testimony in a very transparent way with our congregation, sharing that I have done some things that I ought not to have done, and that in this conversion story and in this baptism, I am declaring a desire to renew and return to Christ and to the cross, that I want to turn from my ways and move in a new direction that follows the cross. This story is powerful not just for the individual who's baptized, but it's a reminder to all of us of our own baptism, that absolutely we are all in need of turning from our ways, regardless of what those are, and to run hard after the cross. Story number 2. A woman from Iran who's converted to Christianity, who was overwhelmed with the love and acceptance of a local congregation, who realized a different story and narrative of what a loving God can actually mean and do for one's life and relationships and so forth. And as this woman shared her testimony in our congregation, again, you are overwhelmed with the power and love of Christ, but you are overwhelmed with the ways in which lives can be transformed in ways that none of us could maybe even imagine and or actually do ourselves. These public acknowledgments are as much for the community as they are for the individual. And so I conclude with this as kind of a reminder of the power of the gospel in and through the local congregation, but providing the systems and structures to acknowledge these things within our own local settings. All right, I'm going to wrap there. I'm going to open it up for a few conversations or questions and such that might come forward. We have other resources that engage these topics at the Flourishing Congregations Institute, and you can check out our website. I have some resources on the table outside, both from some publications related to these and other topics, and of course things that we're doing at Ambrose and so forth to try to help and shape students who are preparing for ministry and otherwise to have a God-listening heart in many aspects of their life and sphere. So, all right, that is me. You may have questions, happy to answer those. If you don't have questions, that's fine. I'm not offended, but I also want to give space and time that if there are some questions, we're happy to answer those. So if you do, maybe just raise your hand. Wow, the hands are coming up quick. So Keitha said we have till 12:45, so we have lots of time and space. No, I'm joking, but we'll, a few questions. All right.
This has been amazing because I think when I don't evangelize, I feel guilty, and I feel guilty a lot. Especially about this. But what intrigued me when you were talking about the challenges, and I came into this service wanting to find out what is it that keeps us from doing this, especially in a church or through a church. And I think it was, you said 41.5% say it's a lack of confidence. Can you dig a little bit more into that?
Yeah.
Confidence in what?
Yeah, a lack of confidence in, just my ability to do so. Like, do I have the gumption, if you will, to actually speak aloud about the things that I believe to be true? And will I be rejected? So I think that's part of the lack of confidence. Two, is a lack of understanding of one's own Christian faith. There's a lot of research that shows that we don't understand our faith very well. This is why I believe so strongly in theological education, right? Your preachers and teachers are your resident theologians in congregational settings. This is why the equipping is so important, so that the equipping of the saints can be more confident in understanding their faith. So I think these are two of the central things that are in play there. Yeah, thank you for your question. All right, a couple hands over here.
Thank you so much for what you've shared today. I actually am one of the people who was converted to Christianity from a family of non-Christians. But my question, and I'm not sure if you want to take this direction,
Sure.
but about the nuns.
Yeah.
So often I think the perception can be that the people who are nuns are people who are maybe not trained well, maybe didn't really understand Christianity.
Yeah.
But my own experience, and I think what I at least hear on podcasts, which that's why I'm asking you if it's accurate, are actually those of us who are deeply embedded within Christianity, deeply know Jesus, are the ones who are actually walking away. And I'm curious about what the sociological data would say about that.
Yeah, thank you for
And what is the message to the church from that?
Yeah. First thing, there are several studies that show that atheists actually know more about the Bible than evangelicals. Okay? Which tells us that atheism is not just a default position. I couldn't find a great option, and therefore. So the takeaway message is actually we should know more about our Bibles in terms of those who are attending church on a regular basis and being immersed with that in an ongoing way. Number two, those who are turning away from their religious faith, more often than not, they have been deeply involved. Okay? And it is a strong and visceral reaction against that for a whole host of reasons. I'm in the middle of a fascinating book titled Why Religion Went Obsolete. And it provides a number of persuasive cultural and social understandings for how and why those who might be raised within religious traditions are finding religion and Christianity in particular to be obsolete within the cultural day that we find ourselves in. And there's so many things that I don't have time to go into here, but I would say that yes, it is among those who are deeply involved. And usually when you convert, just like you're joining a religious group, in a sense you are converting the other way, you often will run as far away as possible. Right? It's not unlike children with parents. Right? You think about how you think and behave today. You either really conform to your parents or you're like, I want to be everything opposite to what my parents did. And you run as far as you can in the opposite direction. In some respects, that is also true. And there's a lot of data that point in that area too. Yeah, thank you. Another hand over there. And Keith, I'm going to ask while we're fielding questions. What time would you like me to wrap? And I will honor that time. We're at 11:15, but you have 5 to 8 minutes? Okay. When they start walking, well, you might regret that. Okay. There's a hand over here and over here. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Joel, one of the themes in your books that I keep seeing a lot is a distinction between organized religion and spirituality in religion. And when you talk about millennials, especially our children, for some of the older members like me in the congregation, you said that they have a lot of options other than organized religion to fulfill their spirituality.
Right.
And we're losing the millennials because they don't like the structure or all the facts you said. So I was wondering, how would you deal with that? I guess kids have options, whereas in our generation, well, my generation, you went to church or you didn't.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for reading my work. It's always a surprise, but always a pleasant surprise, so that's great. And that you summarized it accurately. This is like the second thing. So, listen, this is probably the million-dollar question that parents are trying to grapple with. And there is no single solution to that. And this book that I just referenced on why religion went obsolete captures the many different social and historical changes. Everything from technology to value for pluralism and diversity to giving choice and individualism, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things make it difficult to be religious and to raise children in a religious environment, particularly in some of these organized settings. And so it's difficult for me to say, well, just do this, this, or this, and this will help or happen. What I can say is the family matters greatly. The systems and structures that you set up as parents, there is a lot of data that talks about the problems and challenges of giving children access to technology at younger and younger ages. Okay? And I understand the social challenges that come with that you're then an outsider with your peers if you don't have this. But as soon as you cross this threshold, you have opened up to a whole wave of cultural forces and factors that make these kinds of things difficult. Now, it's not just this. This captures a whole range of things that come about from that. That says, I am my own authority, not the church, not the tradition, not my parent, not the pastor. Okay? That I should have choice. And as you rightly described, there was a generation where we didn't have choice. Right? It's like, no, we're going to church because I'm the parent and you're the child. But the authority has shifted, where children are now the authority in the parent-child relationship. We are now soliciting children for what they want and their opinions and views. Now, there's always a fine line on these things. Please do not hear me saying sort of some authoritarian regime of how we ought to parent, okay? But this changes some of the dynamics that are in play here. There's a lot of really good research that talks about how and why young people actually stick around. I'll just capture a few of the things from the data there. First, they find belonging in a local community. They are given a space and place to form and experience community. 2, they are given opportunities for leadership and ownership. Number 3, they are mentored by other adults who, importantly, are not their parents. Where other adults are taking a vested interest in their life and feeding into their spiritual formation and so forth, and life development, etc., who don't have all the baggage that parents rightly carry in that particular dynamic and context, etc. 4th, they find themselves in religious communities, that create experiential opportunities for them to understand that Christ is an incarnational Christ into their daily life in a number of different ways. So these are just a few. There's many other things that I would say, and I empathize with sort of the shared challenge that many parents and congregations confront across this country. All right, I'm going to take maybe 2 more questions, and then I am around afterwards. I'm happy to continue the conversations there as well. But yeah.
Yeah, so at the beginning, you talked about the need for religion in democracy, as quoted by that professor in Germany.
Yes, Hartmut Rosa.
And I guess my question is, how then would you differentiate that from the trajectory towards religious nationalism that we've seen around the world?
Yes, very good, very good. And Rosa speaks about this in the text, and I will reiterate it here. Of course, there are many bad examples of religious life, okay? And that is a problem to be mindful of. And so when we talk about, and sort of Rosa's thesis is that democracies need religion, it is of a particular kind of religion. And it's a religion that embraces this listening heart, first and foremost to God, and then embraces a listening heart to one another in our different social spheres. And I would argue that religions that are constantly vying for political and social power, that do so, A, without listening, and B, in a way that is clearly intent on marginalizing all kinds of groups in the process, is not the kind of religion that Rosa or I am referring to here. And so we need to be very careful and attentive to that in the process. Yeah, thank you. All right, hand over here, and then hand over here, and then I will wrap? Or am I handing it back to you, Keith? Do you want me to take one more? Okay, we'll go one more here, in the middle.
Very much for today. Question about the StatsCan data.
Yes.
How was Canadian defined? Was it citizen or immigrant or?
Right.
And second, where was any of the racial data in that?
Yes. Permanent residents, complete survey for this. And the racial data, you will find, which I didn't present here, but you will find among many different racialized communities, particularly from the global south and east, high concentration among different religious traditions. Almost half among immigrants to Canada in the latest census identify as Christian. Okay? Which we don't often think about. We assume it's automatically Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, and so forth, and that has certainly grown, right, over the course of time, but almost half of immigrants to Canada from the global south and east identify as Christians, so we see a strong representation. And this has implications for what congregations will look like, and we see and experience this here and many other churches of growing racial diversity, but you also find monoracial congregations, right? You'll find ethnic and cultural specific congregations that are birthed across the country. That is the trajectory we are on, and this is where 25 years from now, the conversations within local churches is a prominent piece that has all kinds of ripple effects. So, yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Predominantly white. Yes. Yeah. Predominantly white.
All right. Thank you. Can we thank Joel?
Thanks, Peter.
So now that you have lots of information, I encourage you to go for lunch with someone. And don't forget that on the 22nd, Stu, Reverend Ken, and myself, Reverend Keitha, we're going to be having a Q&A as well. And we have some sheets that you'll get again next week that you can write some questions perhaps that weren't answered here as we continue talking about this. And in all things, we take what we want, we let go of what isn't helpful, and we also are not afraid to wrestle with that which makes us feel incongruent. And so I hope that you're able to do that work. The picking up, the letting go, and the wrestling, not just throwing it all away or taking it all, but being able to take it. And to really think about the value of data versus our perceptions, which oftentimes is the challenge. We all think, X, Y, and Z, and we can fit people in different categories. And then when we read something, we're like, oh, actually, we're wrong. So thank you so much for sharing, for helping us to explore this from a different perspective. And next week we continue. We'll be talking about the word pay attention in regards to this topic. And for those who are interested, I'm going to be leaning heavily into Leonard Sweet's work from the book called Nudge. And so if you want to pay $115 to get the book, you can. It's an older book, so it's hard to find, or to get an ebook if you so desire. But in the midst of this, I do hope that you are challenged, and I do hope that your faith is stretched, and I do hope that your own internal dialogue is kind of moving forward, and that you find someone to dialogue with as well. Let me pray with us before we go. God, we thank you for the good news, which is you. And we thank you that you have given us this opportunity to not just live this out, but to speak it out about what it is and who it is that you are and what it is that you're doing in the world. And so, God, as we navigate this, God, we ask that that you would help us to frame and to reframe what it means for us to be disciples and what it looks like for us to be formed as ones who follow after you. And so go before us into this week. In your name, amen. Have a blessed week.